In just a few weeks, I'm relaunching this podcast. It will be the same topic. Don't worry, I'm not going into something completely different, but there are going to be some differences, and it's going to be in just 6 episodes. I'm so excited. And I want to bring you behind the scenes, not because I think you need the technical details, but because I know that you want to know how these decisions are made on a strategic level so that my podcast support my business. This podcast is a top ranked podcast. At the time of this recording, it has reached over 100 countries, which is crazy. So I want you to know why I made this decision, what is changing, and how you can start thinking about making these changes for your content as well. Let's go. Hello, my love. Welcome to Brand Confidence for Creatives. Are you feeling stuck in a cycle of overthinking, trying to build your brand? I'm Eugenia, but you can call me E. I'm a marketing and brand coach, and I spent years stuck in the cycle of researching, hesitating, and hiding until I got clear on my voice and my message. In this podcast, I'll guide you through the strategies you need to get clear on what you want to say, build a personal brand, and create consistent magnetic marketing. If you ever thought, I know I have something to say, I just don't know how to say it, you are in the right place. So grab your coffee and let's dive in. Okay, so for a little bit of context, this is my third podcast. I launched the first one ever in 2017. It was in Spanish, and no one knew what a podcast was. Like, I created a graphic explaining the concept of a podcast, how it was like a radio show that you listen on the internet whenever you wanted to. And I did that for a year. It was so fun. It was a podcast for female empowerment, and I was doing so many interviews with amazing women. I had 3 partners from inception of the idea to the end. And it didn't work out because our goals weren't aligned. Like, I wanted the podcast to be this big thing that carried my brand and built a business through it. And for my partners, it was just like a fun hobby. And that caused a lot of frustration in a little immature me who never aligned on expectations at the time. So I did that for a year until it was just too hard and too many changes with partners. And the lesson from that first podcast is be clear on why you want a podcast. That is a lesson I learned in 2018 when I stopped doing that podcast, is that you got to be clear with yourself and with everyone that you bring into your show and into your team. Why are they there? There's nothing wrong if someone is just there to like have fun and have a hobby. As long as you are both clear on it and what that means for production and investment, and even with yourself, like, are you having a podcast because you just want to express an idea that you have in your mind and in your heart? Or do you really want that to be center for your business? You are not just looking at a podcast, but you are really looking at a show that's going to be strategic and it's going to be bigger in terms of impact that it has on your leads, on your conversions, on your opportunities for speaking, etc., etc., etc. You do have to have so much clarity on why you want to start a podcast. So then I launched, or had an attempt of launching, Vino Break. So my second podcast, I divided into like 2.A and 2.B. So 2.8 was Vino Break. And it was in English. So it was my first podcast in English. And I just felt like there was such an interesting market and interesting Latinas doing amazing things in the English market. So I did the branding, the concept, the marketing with the same people who did my first, actually the same person who's done all of my like artwork now that or most of them. So I was super excited. It was this brand. And I recorded the first episode, I think an interview or two, and I stopped because my life was not in a good place. I have talked about this before, how I felt that I was almost like a divided person, like Batman. I was a corporate person by day, super serious, having to look and sound very what I thought was professional. And then I had this creative side that I didn't feel like I could show or I had to hide. And it was more like funny and silly. And I felt like they didn't match because I was too serious for fully creative environments and too creative for fully serious environments. So anyway, I didn't know how to handle that at that time. So that podcast didn't really live the execution. So it was great while it was in my head, but it didn't live in the long term. So I was part of what's like the majority of the podcast who don't make it past episode 8, which you have an idea and you're excited and you work hard and then you launch it and then you're like, okay, the initial motivation to launch is over. How do I sustain this? What's crazy though is that to this day, people are listening to that podcast. That podcast that I launched in 2019 lived for 2 episodes. People are still listening. Obviously, it's not a top podcast by any means, but people are still finding those episodes and listening to those episodes. And that is because that podcast was more specific, because it was more still the concept of female empowerment, but it was specifically for Latinas and for Latinas wanting to do great in the US and like be inspired by other stories in the US. So it was very specific. And I think that specificity is what has carried the podcast all of these years, where there's nothing new on that feed, but people are still finding that podcast and people are still listening to it. So there are 2 lessons here. Number 1, the energy to launch a podcast is not going to be the same type of energy that's going to lead you or lead you to sustain it. You need systems and you need structure, and you also need a plan beyond just let's get it launched, which is why I'm not a fan of just focusing on the launch. You need to focus also on what happens after. But also it is so important to have a concept and a thesis and the branding of the show that are specific for a specific person. I'm not a fan of just like specific niche, like Latina who's 25 working from home, or like I'm not talking about something so specific, but I am talking about a specific audience with a specific dream or desire versus what I did on the first episode, which was just generally female empowerment. So then what I call 2B, because Pin a Break, I mean, yes, it's a launch, but it just lasted for 2 episodes. So 2B came a year after. It was also in English, and that was fairly bold. And that was truly like my branding brain in steroids after learning so much. Like I've just realized that I love building a brand, and I had a more clear thesis because now I was speaking still to women and within the realm of empowerment, but now I was analyzing the intersection between femininity and power and how that means leadership. Because at the time, there was a message for women that said that we had to almost behave like men if we wanted to be powerful, and anything that was feminine was deemed as less than. So it was a time where women that were feminine were wearing all these flowy dresses and hats. And then on the other side, you had the super serious with blazers and trousers woman. So I wanted to speak to the woman who was feminine, but she didn't fit in the whole like flowy dresses, fully in her feminine, and also in the whole like trousers and blazers, which nothing wrong with it. I think they are super fashionable, but it's just like the idea, like the concept of it. I wanted to speak to a woman who wanted to live in her feminine, I would say energy, but I don't want this to sound like woo-woo, but just like truly act and behave like a woman while being a leader and while handling and inspiring to roles where she would have power, whether in her own business, in her own career. And I love the thesis. I still stand by the belief that women can be in powerful roles while still being feminine and still being and having a family or having impact and nurturing nonprofits or animals. I have a friend who is such a nurturer person towards animals, and she rescues animals, and it's just like this feminine side of her. So anyways, I did that podcast, but it was my first, I would say, podcast with a lot of solo episodes. There was a lot of thesis behind it, a lot of thinking behind it, because every episode I was researching topics, I was writing them. Also, it was the first time when I was having such a solo I would say discourse in English. So every episode was taking me around 4 to 5 hours to plan and record. and then 2 or 3 to edit, because I would make a lot of mistakes. I didn't sound fluid. And of course, this was 2020, 2021. That was before AI or anything like that. So it was a very lengthy process, and I burned out. It was exhausting to me. And obviously, I was expecting that I would launch my podcast with such a passion and like a fun brand and a clear message. And I was expecting that I would, like, truly, I would be found by a studio and they would sign me and I was going to be a star. Like that's it. That was my plan. And also, I didn't have my mindset in place. So I started comparing myself with other friends who launched podcasts at the same time and they were ranking immediately. And I was like, okay, why is my podcast not ranking? Why is my podcast not growing? Maybe it's not as valuable as I thought. And also, because of the topics I was talking about, I started receiving some hate comments or pushback from people that were thinking that I was having the wrong perspective. I'm not gonna open those debates because it's not the point of this episode, but just having that pushback on social media was hard for me mentally because I was not prepared for that. And I was saying, like, why am I receiving more hate or pushback that I'm receiving positive comments saying, you've helped me, you've done a great thing, like, I love your podcast. I was receiving more pushback. Now I understand that people tend to be more vocal about what they don't like than about what they like. And also, podcasting, just audio, is not a platform where it's easy to leave a comment. Right now with Spotify, you can leave comments. I guess that it's a little bit easier. But at the time, for people to go out of their way to your Instagram to leave you a nice comment, that was not usual. Like, people would not leave the platform to just go leave you a comment, where if they were triggered by something you said, yes, they were going to go wherever they had to go find you and tell you what they thought. So my lesson there, I stopped the podcast after a year. My lesson there was, first of all, you need to have a defined workflow. You need to have a system that makes it simple and a no-brainer for you to record. Also, there's no substitution for experience. Like, if you've never done something, in my case, I had never done something like that in English before, where such a long episodes and processing in English and just having eloquence in English. I had never done that before. So it is unrealistic of me to think that I'm going to sound, or I'm going to be like the most effective speaker when I'm just doing that for the first time. So I learned that I have to be patient with myself and I have to track for the things that matter. So if I were to go back to that time, I would say, hey, right now, your goal is to get efficient with production. Your goal is not just to rank and be discovered and all these things, which is going to take me to lesson 2 from this period. Your goal really is going to be get good at it, get going with it, make sure that your workflow makes sense to you so that then you can think of all these other avenues. But if it's not sustainable to you, what do you want to grow? Something that is not sustainable in ways of production and even not in your mind. And then also, you need to have a plan. And in business, being found by someone and hoping that someone will give you an opportunity and sign you, that is such a passive way to think about your business. You need to think of your podcast as your brand and as a channel that takes people to something else. Like, a podcast is not just the end destination that people listen to. The podcast is connected to something else that you have out there. So that lack of forward thinking or seeing the big picture also makes people frustrated, because they're thinking, oh, I was thinking, I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but I was thinking, why hasn't someone found me? Versus, okay, I need to also develop something. This podcast needs to connect with something else I am doing or selling. The podcast cannot be the end result or like the end of my brand. The podcast needs to be like literally a channel, and people need to move towards something. What is that something? I didn't figure it out. I didn't even ask myself about that. So that was a lesson from that era, era to point A to point B. And then we enter podcast number 3, which is the one you're listening right now. And originally it was called Creator to Leader. I love that name. I still have the domain. I love the brand. But it was a little bit hard to explain what it meant. because my thesis with that podcast was we are overwhelmed with creating content because we are thinking like creators. So we are in platforms and we are just in mode of creating, but we need to think of leadership, which is a different perspective. But I think it was too philosophical. And in having conversations, people were having a hard time understanding what the podcast was about. So after a year and a half, probably, I changed the name to something more searchable, which is Brand Confidence for Creatives. And it was easier to understand. Everyone understood what it was about. And even right now, if you ask Google what the podcast is, Google AI is going to give you a description that, mind you, is not accurate to my brand, which is part of this process, but it is easy to understand. It is easy to explain. It is not so philosophical. So that change came with the same cover art, the same overall concept. It was just a name change. And of course, obviously, I had to change the intro and the outro. So I feel like those were changes to this podcast, but it was never something that was a stake in the ground, like this is the new era. It was mostly changing one thing here, one thing there. So I think it created confusion, not so much with people, but with just the algorithm and the platforms and the podcast. I've seen that it has stopped being recommended by the platforms just because I'm seeing the rate of growth is not as fast as it used to. And I think it has to do with not having a definite moment of change. It's more like slowly piecing together different changes to the podcast. So that has been something that has made me realize that I need to bring it all together to my true vision. But I cannot complain in terms of workflow. Like, getting my podcast done is so easy for me. I can write an outline, record, edit, and write show notes and schedule the whole thing probably like in an hour and a half, because my workflow has gotten so efficient. Also, because I've been doing podcasting, if you count the 2020 podcast, it's been almost 6 years. So obviously, I've gotten so much better at writing down my ideas and giving a speech, even right now, where I didn't really write a detailed outline because this is a very personal episode for me. So even me speaking eloquently easier, that is a result of me practicing and just putting in my reps and stay consistent, but because I did have the workflow. And also, this podcast has stayed with me through so many transitions. Like, ups and downs personally, big moves, moving from North Carolina to Miami, then in Miami again, having my baby, having a short break. Like, I always was able to come back to it and feel like I had something to say. Like, this podcast has never felt like it felt with Fairly Bold, where I would sit down to write an outline. I would feel like I have nothing to say, or I was paralyzed for what if someone doesn't like it. And mind you, way more people listen to this podcast than any of my podcasts ever had an audience. So I technically have more people here who could message me and say, I hate what you're saying. And I truly do not think about it. It is not in my mind. So I'm so grateful for the way this podcast was set up. This podcast I built with everything I had created, from podcast management and having my own podcast, working in marketing. So I'm like, not only this podcast had an amazing launch where it ranked, and you know that story, it was wonderful, but also it's been sustainable and it's been growing my business sustainably. I, through this podcast, had a client who was like, oh my gosh, I love what you're doing. It sounds like you're building a new program. Can I work with you? And she was sold before we ever got on a call and before I had clarity on the promise of the program. She was like, I just want that result. So all in all, it's been a great run. So I cannot complain. That's why I'm not launching a new podcast. I'm just relaunching this one because this one has been incredible. Like, I can't complain of this episode. It's just ready for the next season. So now we're getting close to episode 100, and it's time for the official rebrand, where I take the podcast through my whole process again. And my lesson here from everything I've learned in this, like all these years doing this podcast, is that you need to have strategy and you need your soul in your podcast. Because the first two podcasts, like era one, era two, it was pure soul. I didn't really have a strategy, a business strategy, a distribution strategy, a growth strategy. And then with creator to leader, I still was leaning into soul a little bit too much, even though it had more strategy for sure and more structure. But I overcorrected with the name Brand Confidence for Creatives and being overly strategic and overly, I would say, overly analytical in a way, where the podcast lost a little bit of the flavor and the soul in the way of its creation. So now it is a time of having both. You need soul, you need your worldview, your value, because the podcast needs to have the soul and the worldview and values, but the podcast also needs a strategy. The podcast also needs to know where it's going, how it's going to make you money, what's the role, how are titles supposed to work, how do you do show notes, like how do you make an outline, how do you pitch, like you do need that strategy, but you also need your soul and your live, and you need to keep it interesting. So I think that I've found that balance, which is that new season. It is a season of being strategic and specific, but also going larger for the mission that I feel God has given me of empowering mission driven, do good people to be seen, to be heard, to use their voice, to use their story, to reach others, to make money, to make an impact. And I am great at it. And this podcast needs to be bigger so more people can use their voice, can use their strengths, can use their vision, their experiences to make an impact in the world. So what I'm changing in this new season is the name. I'm changing the cover art. I'm changing the specific promise and thesis of the show. And I'm also changing a little bit of the planning process because I also want to be more structured and plan ahead, because I believe that soul and passion do not need to be separated from structure and strategy. So it's a refresh. I'm so different from who I was when I launched. I think just becoming a mom is like makes you a whole new person. And also I have learned a lot about my audience. So this new era is going to serve them even better. It's going to serve you even better. So I'm so excited because it's all these things that I know you want, because I have years of data of the things that you like and the specific problems that you have, the specific desires that you have. And I'm like, okay, girl, let's go solve these problems. Let's go get them to where they want to go, to where they know it's possible to go, and use the information that you have to serve them even better. So for you, what this means, if you are in the season of like maybe redoing your podcast, revamping it, relaunching, or maybe you're thinking about launching your podcast or launching a long form platform, your values and your vision need to be the foundation of it. Like 100%. You do need to start there with your soul. And then bring in the strategy. Your audience needs to set the direction of where you're going. You need to treat your audience as the executive producers of your show. That way, you are never going to have a bad day, because you are going to always be in pursuit of, let me serve you from my vision and my values, obviously, because that's why I'm telling you that that's the foundation. But let me use what I have, my resources, to serve you. And also in terms of technicalities, I've spent the past year testing so many things. I have a whole project with Claude because I've been testing a lot, like what works, what doesn't. What if I put this title versus that title? What about this, like show notes? What about call to action here or there? What about, like, I've tested a lot, and I have the data to really put it together in more an organized framework for this new era of my podcast. So the plan is to launch this revamp by episode 100. So this is episode 94. So we are only 6 episodes away. This is so exciting. So stay tuned. You can go to my Instagram. I'm making a series there taking you through more of the detail. So you can go follow there. My Instagram is @eugenia.wu. That's @EUGENIA WOO. Obviously, my links are always in the show notes. Go follow there. Send me your questions because I'm wondering if we could do like a Q&A. I don't know if before or after the launch of how this process went, but go there because that's going to be the best way for us to connect. And yes, I would love to bring you along for the journey. See you back here very soon. Thank you for your support. Thank you for letting my story inspire you. And I hope and I pray that I can continue doing so in the years to come. So see you back here very soon. Un beso. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you loved it, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to a friend who's also trying to grow their brand without losing themselves in the process. And if you want to make my day, drop a quick review on Apple Podcasts. Seriously, it means the world to me. And I know that this show is helping you show up with confidence and clarity. See you back here soon for the next episode. Un beso.